And hope that this works. Hi, folks. It's Lloyd Auerbach, Professor Paranormal. Hopefully, you will be seeing my face. Otherwise, okay. I'm seeing the animation and such happening. So hopefully this is all going to be switching over and you'll be able to see my lovely face. And if not, you can hear my voice and we can start talking about the subject matter in a little bit. So are we going to be seeing the intro here in a moment, or you're skipping that? Okay. Okay. All right. So hopefully I'll see myself coming up and I'll know that's going on. All right, Sandra. Apparently they're hearing the music now, which doesn't really help if they're not hearing my voice. Okay. All right. We will cover a few things tonight. I've got a couple of things to talk about, specifically the classes I have coming up. And I thought at some point when we have a lull, I might even tell a ghost story or two. So we'll see how that actually runs. Just waiting for everything just to kind of fall into place for the video. I know we had problems last week. Um, we're having some problems today. I think there's some ghosts in the machine, actually. So let's start out with talking a little bit about the classes coming up. If folks don't have any immediate questions, First class I have starting on October 9th is an advanced field investigations class, which does have prerequisites to it. But that includes having a conversation with me to make sure you have the basics of that work in the past. If you've taken the field investigations class from the Rhine before, or perhaps have the knowledge in your pocket already, then that works. If you are relatively new, I have a little quiz that people can take to opt out of that first class as well. But on Wednesday nights, starting on October 11th, I will be teaching a class called Paranormal Cases. So it's really a look at some of my cases involved. So think of it as a deep dive into some of my cases, but also into some more historic cases or some other folks' cases, including the Seaford poltergeist, which is the case in 1958 on Long Island that generated our model, or kind of led to our model of where we think poltergeists are today with living agents and how to deal with them. And also be dealing with a couple of other situations as well. A reincarnation case or two by the folks at University of Virginia. And I'm seeing something here from my producer. Okay, so I guess we can't do much about that, huh? At this point. All right, so hopefully you'll be able to see everything that's going on as we go through. I don't have anything specific to show. So my cases course will take a really deep dive into some of the cases I've written up and a couple that I haven't written up that much. I can see myself popping up now. That's on Wednesday nights, starting October 9th, and it runs through the first week of December, partly because there's a week that I'll be away. For those of you that might be in the Durham, North Carolina area, we've got the intro playing right now. I assume the music is playing now, so hopefully, I don't know if people can hear me over the music as well. Hi, Paul. Good to see you. I can hear the music playing a little bit in the background. Anyway, I will also be in Durham, North Carolina around the 11th. All right, hang on just a second. I'm getting some echo here. And now I'm gone. All right, I've got a serious echo here right now. Um, I'm not quite sure what's going on. Just the video has completely disappeared now. So can folks see me just out of curiosity? And Mike, I think maybe your mic is open. All right, that's probably better. Okay, I'm going to assume people can hear me. I don't know that people can see me at this point, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and go on voice only. So I will be, as I mentioned, I'm going to be in Durham, North Carolina, probably doing a workshop. Should be a workshop on the afternoon of the 11th of November. It's a Saturday afternoon. So if anybody is in the North Carolina area, watch for that announcement on the Rhine website, and I'll also be letting folks know here and posting it in a few other places as well. I'm not quite sure what we're going to be doing yet, but we'll be doing something fun at that workshop. And it'll be live in person for a small group in North Carolina, but it will also be online. So there's going to be an online component. People can just jump in on that as well. And like I said, it'll be an event run by the Rhine Center, which is rhine.org. It's actually one of the links that's in the description of the show today. So those three classes, those three things are coming up. For those of you who might be in the Bay Area, on October 14th from 11 to 1 a.m., I will be in San Ramon, California. I will be posting some information about that. I'm speaking at a community center in San Ramon next to the library, the San Ramon Library for the county, the Contra Costa County Library System. Don't know if there's anything else coming up yet. I'm sure there will be, but we'll talk about that. And hopefully we will have our video issue fixed yet again for next week. So nice to see folks here. And I guess the question for me to start with before I start in on anything else is, do any of you have any questions or topics you'd like me to address? And thank you, Tina, for telling me I'm a talking head. Always good being a talking head. All right, so why don't I start with a couple of ghost stories? And I want to start out with a couple of experiences that were related to me that are really interesting ghostly experiences. The first one was told to me by a talk show host here in San Francisco back in the mid-1980s, back when we actually had talk shows on a local level that were on the local channels. And this particular individual, we were doing a show on ghosts. It was a Halloween show, of course, for this talk show. The manager of the Winchester Mystery House was with us. Antoinette May, who wrote a book on haunted places in California, was there. And we're just talking in general. The host acted very skeptical, of course, just asking pointed questions. And at the very end, he pulls me aside and says, "Hey, do you want to hear my ghost story?" Now, I have to say right off the bat that I get so many people who come out as skeptical in a group and then pull me aside and tell me a psychic experience or a ghost story or something like that. So in this case, this individual grew up in a haunted farmhouse for part of his childhood. They had moved there, I think, when he was around 10 or 12. And it was in Ohio. And they were told the place was haunted. And for years, they were hearing footsteps in the upstairs hallway going past the bedrooms backwards and back and forth. And they would go out in the hallway and turn the lights on, and there wouldn't be anything there. And they just got used to it. So Patrick, at one point, he said, when he was actually, I think it was 16 at the time, he decided he was going to try to find out where the footsteps went. Now, by the way, it didn't matter if they left the hall light on or not. So he left the hall light on. And when he heard the footsteps go past his door, he actually opened the door. Nobody's there. He's still hearing the footsteps. And he follows the sound of the footsteps, which were about 10 feet ahead of him. And the footsteps at that point were headed towards the stairs going down to the first floor. He follows after the footsteps, and he noted that the footsteps started going faster. That had never happened before. He starts moving a little faster. He hears the footsteps going down the stairs fairly quickly. He starts going down the stairs, flicking on lights as he goes for downstairs. He hears the footsteps come off the stairs ahead of him and practically run into the living room. Now, they had hardwood floors, and they had area rugs on the floor. He said as he's about to get into the living room, he hears the sound of a scuffling sound and a thud. Turns on the light in the living room. There's the edge of the carpet. The rug is bunched up. He said, and this is a paraphrase, it's not an exact quote. I have the quote written down elsewhere. But I heard this, is what he said, is I heard the sound of somebody getting up and brushing themselves off. Then the footsteps ran for the front door. Not like the front door opened or anything, but that was the last time they heard the ghostly footsteps. So his reaction was, I guess some ghosts are clumsy. And my response to that is, one of the best ways possibly to get rid of ghosts is to embarrass them out of your house. All right, so that's one experience. I kind of have an adage I've been using since before my first book came out, which is ghosts are people too. And that's what we're dealing with, the spirits or apparitions or consciousness of people after death. I had another story told to me by a producer at the Joan Rivers show when I did that show back in 1989. Flew to New York, and we were doing a show on friendly ghosts. And there, I believe I have segments of that show actually up on my YouTube channel, my other YouTube channel, which is just simply youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach. In this particular story, a good friend of this producer's, this had apparently just happened like a month before. And what the producer said was that his friend was driving his car in the hills outside in the Hollywood, Los Angeles area. And something happened with his car and it literally went off the road down an embankment, flipped over multiple times. Now, he was in the car with his German Shepherd. Car flips over multiple times. It ends up upside down, and part of the car is crushed, and he is stuck in the car. It didn't take long. It was only, he said, as far as he knew, because he wasn't unconscious, it was very quick that people started coming down the embankment to help him. So several people came down and they started moving the car, rocking it back and forth. They were able to unhook his seatbelt and pull him out of the car. And one of the people said to him, "It's a good thing your dog was barking in the street to stop us." So apparently the German Shepherd, according to the witnesses, this German Shepherd had been in the middle of the road barking at oncoming traffic until people stopped. So as they moved the car a little bit further to really pull him all the way out, someone noted by pointing towards the rear part of the car that the car was crushed. And in the crushed car was the crushed German Shepherd. No one saw the German Shepherd again on the road. The German Shepherd had led them down the embankment and then disappeared. So this is a case where, either there was a roving German Shepherd who decided to help people, to help these folks, who then just ran off at that point, or the ghost of this man's pet saved his life or prevented any further damage in that way. We do occasionally have reports of apparitions of pets. It's not common, but it's also not uncommon. I think it's just not commonly reported. I'm pretty sure that after one of my cats died, I was seeing him out of the corner of my eye and even sometimes full on from time to time for a while. So pretty interesting stuff. And I get people telling me their stories quite often. And of course, that's different than walking in on a case and having somebody tell me the story there. So doesn't look like we have any questions yet. I'll mention another one with a pet. A friend of mine, Ankasha Amenti, who is a really great psychic and medium, lives up in the Seattle area these days. I got to know her down when she was working here in the Bay Area, living in the Bay Area. And she took one of my classes, and we ended up hitting it off mainly because of our joint interest in comic books. And she did a lot of work with me, casework over the years. And even from time to time, we still kind of hook up and do investigations together. It's pretty rare these days, unfortunately. But she was living for a time in Minneapolis, and I actually visited and did a workshop with her there. And there was a really interesting situation she told me about. She was, for every year she was in, or every so often in Minneapolis, she'd go to this haunted B&B and do a mediumship workshop there. And the owner had a cat that somehow got into people's rooms. It didn't matter if you closed the door at night, the cat would be in your room the next morning. And this was when the cat was, fully healthy and all of that. This was going on for months and months. So one night, Ankasha just remembered being woken up by the cat getting into bed with her. And that also was reported by guests for quite some time. I don't know that they ever figured out how the cat got into people's rooms, but that's a different story. In any event, in the next morning, Ankasha was talking to the owner at breakfast and mentioned, as she often did, or as anyone often did, the cat got into the room and got into bed. And the owner looked at her and said, the cat died a couple months ago. So apparently the ghost of the cat was still continuing the habit that she had while she was alive. Again, we get kind of really interesting stories like this from time to time. Okay. Anybody have any questions or topics at the moment? I'm just kind of seeing some comments about the stories, a couple stories. And if not, I can kind of continue in this vein, if you'd like. All right, let's see what else. What can I'm just looking at just kind of a list of stories that might be kind of fun to talk about here. Um, you know, hospice experiences. Okay. Um, I don't have any hospice experiences myself, but I have. There was. Trying to think about how long ago this was. Maybe about 10 years ago. I was at a friend's party in Alameda, California, and a couple of of their friends were hospice workers, and I was just talking. We are just talking. My wife and I were just talking to people there, and I started when I found out they were hospice workers. I asked them flat out if any of the folks that they were that were there in the hospice or that they were attending to had ever talked about seeing relatives or spirits or anything like that. And one of them, the guy basically said that this was not uncommon. And what was really interesting is that he also had seen a couple of the apparitions that the people were reporting himself. So this is the idea of what are called deathbed apparitions or deathbed spirits is something that has been researched and written about since the late 1800s. Is one of the phenomena that was identified by the Society for Psychical Research. There's a book called Deathbed Visions, which you can find, you may be able to find used, but I believe it's actually on the Internet Archive for free. It's by Sir William Barrett, and it goes into stories that people had, the SPR and others had collected of people who were in the process of dying, who saw friends, relatives, and other people coming to kind of help them take them away, help them to the other side, more or less. That's where we end up with instances that are reported as something called hyperlucidity, where the person may have actually had been in dementia or sedated or Alzheimer's. They might have had Alzheimer's. And all of a sudden, when they're seeing the spirits, they're also able to carry on perfectly good conversations with any of the living people around them with full memory. So if it's somebody who has a dementia or a form of Alzheimer's or something else, somebody who was sedated comes out of sedation and is able to communicate and talk about this completely clearly. And that's still hyperlucidity itself is not understood. It's not something that happens to everybody either. My late colleague Annette Martin, when she passed away in here in the Bay Area in 2011, and actually the anniversary of her death was last week, was 9/11. That was the anniversary of her death. She, according to her husband, he was there at the very end with two of Annette's mediumship students who were very good mediums on their own. And Annette had been sedated heavily, but she came out of sedation completely clear, started talking about seeing her parents there, as well as a couple of beings of light as she talked about them. And while Bruce himself did not see them, apparently the two mediumship students did. And so did apparently one of the hospice workers. And Annette had talked about her parents being there to help her transition to the other side. And there was a little joke about, she's a medium. She doesn't really need help. So, and then I have to mention that Annette, a couple of years later, has come through a number of mediums, pushing through, including butting in on situations where she wasn't invited, more or less. So it's always really cool to hear from her on the other side, or from the other side as well. Okay. Let's move on to something else. Let's see. So here's an interesting thing. Actually, I was just asked about this situation by a colleague of mine. There are, we talk about poltergeist cases in this world. And here in the US, we refer to poltergeist cases. First of all, they're almost exclusively physical activity. Apparitions are rarely, if ever, seen. And it's pretty interesting in that we can typically figure out who the culprit is, who the poltergeist agent is, and very often what the psychological dynamics are. Although in a number of cases, it can be neurological, something like epilepsy, epileptiform activity in the brain that's responsible. Um, okay, so Tony is asking about my thoughts on the Enfield poltergeist. I knew Maurice Grosse a little bit and talked to him about it. I know Guy Lyon Playfair was a straight shooter. I'm not quite sure 100% whether there was a combination of factors. I think there was possibly both an apparition and psychokinesis caused by a living agent in that case. But most of the cases we deal with tend to be living agent only, with apparitions sometimes causing the problem by being the stress point for that. So years ago, I had a case similar to one that one of my fellow faculty members, Julian Isaacs, had in the UK. And that was a family here in the Bay Area. It was actually not a traditional family. It was a 14-year-old girl and her grandparents. Her parents had died in a car accident a year before. She was living with her grandparents. And she had not really grieved. As we learned from the grandparents, she hadn't really grieved. So when we went into the case, the reported instance of activity was bursts of water splashing the grandparents from time to time. The girl was in the house or usually in the room, and in full view and was not throwing water at them. Water would mysteriously drench their clothing in drawers. And all of that was going on for a little over a month when we got into the case. So one of the folks with me started asking the questions about grief when we found out the factors to do with the parents. And one of the things that happens in poltergeist cases is that the activity can sometimes represent something specific in the psychology of the agent. Sometimes it's the physical activity or the activity that's happening indicates the stressor or the person who is stressing out. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Sometimes it's something being held inside. Usually there's not a release of whatever the stress is. In this case, it was pretty clear, because I just asked a simple question: was the water salty? And one of the grandparents said yes, and kind of looked at me in a kind of a crazy way. And it was because the girl wasn't crying. She was holding in her grief. And the water was representative of her tears. And when we talked this over and we had her talk to a counselor, she did start crying down. She kind of broke down and let that out. There was not another poltergeist activity instance after that. So the water had stopped completely at that point. All right, let me just take a look at the questions here. What do you think of the bystander case? You have to give me a little more information. I don't know that specific case. So you have to give me more information about that particular case for me to comment on that. Physiology seems to matter and the ability to see apparitions. Actually, we don't think it's physiology the way you think of it. It's psychic ability seems to matter because it's not about the eyes. It's very clear apparitions are not an optical phenomenon. They are a psychic phenomenon. So someone is not seeing apparitions with their eyes no matter what their eyes are. There's a lot of very specific logic behind this and common sense. Most importantly, there has never been any indication that there's been something about the eyes of people who see one apparition but don't see another that other people are seeing. Why would that be? But there's a lot of factors that are involved here. Okay, so the other poltergeist case I just wanted to mention was one I had in New York. When I was visiting my folks in the early 2000s, actually. Just happened I'd gotten this call before I came to New York. I was going to be in Westchester County the week later, so I went to this apartment where this woman, there had been reports, she had reported that there was a lot of unusual physical activity, mainly things around the TV changing channels, even though the remote was in their hands, and appliances turning on and off on their own, mainly in the kitchen. Most importantly, some of the appliances that were turning on were not plugged in. What was going on, though, is when in interviewing her, she was a new mother, The baby was 6 months old at the time, I believe, and she had stayed on maternity leave much longer. She was a nurse. She stayed out on maternity leave much longer, and she and her husband were arguing about her going back to work. She wanted to go back to work, but she also didn't because there were childcare issues. Although her mother lived very close, was willing to do childcare. And anytime they argued about her work situation, it was not even a money situation so much, but there was some element of that. Anytime that happened, this activity would happen in the kitchen. Anytime that her husband was locked in on watching a football game and she wanted to talk about things, about anything that was more emotional, that's when the TV channels would start changing. Things would happen occasionally when she was on the phone with her husband arguing about this stuff. So it was clearly she was the person, the agent. Most interesting about this was when I asked about her husband's, interest in her going back to work versus not going back to work. She said he's conflicted because she said, I think he really would prefer that I stay barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. And that kind of was the key to that. It was this whole work situation. She was being stressed out about having to be the homemaker. She had very conflicted about that, and that activity was kind of playing out in that way. Okay. So Tony is saying what I found most interesting were the voices of the little girls. Again, I'm not familiar enough about that case to say anything about that in an intelligent way. Paul, what are your thoughts about the temporal lobe and supernatural activities? Mel Morse does talk about this in his books because he's worked for years with Vernon Neppy. Dr. Vernon Neppy runs the Psychoneuroimmunology Institute in Seattle. I've known Vernon since he was at Cornell Medical Center Medical School, which had a campus in White Plains, New York. I knew him actually when I was working at the ASPR. And Vernon is a neuropsychiatrist and parapsychologist, a very deep thinker, and very focused on finding out what's going on in the brain when people are psychic or having these experiences. And quite a lot he's found has to do with temporal lobe. And in fact, this is where we have a better understanding to some extent about some of these poltergeist cases, which are neurological, that one study that was done back in the 70s of 104 poltergeist, 102 poltergeist agents by Jerry Salfin and Bill Roll, that about 30% of those poltergeist agents had either a form of epilepsy, full-blown epilepsy in some instances, or they had been diagnosed with epileptiform activity in the temporal lobes. Later on, Neppy and, of course, Morse was connected to this as well, found that a number of different kinds of experiences had to do with the temporal lobes as well. So there's definitely a connection here to that. I wouldn't call them supernatural activities, but certainly paranormal ones. Whether or not that the temporal lobes are directly involved in being psychic or just in specific type of experiences is still unknown because it's kind of hard. I don't believe there's been really a lot of research, in fact, any research specifically with some psychics and mediums looking at what's going on in the temporal lobes when they're, let's say, doing channeling or communicating. So that needs to possibly be done as well. Okay. I assume this is the bystander phenomena. Apparition of someone's just deceased grandfather, but only visible to a percipient who is having high fever. The thing we do know is that altered states of consciousness allow us to possibly be more psychic or open to phenomena. And a high fever puts you into an altered state. Illness, especially fevers, will put people into an altered state of consciousness. So it's not the case. I mean, it may be the case in this particular instance, but there hasn't been any sort of pattern where people who see an apparition are in fever. In fact, the majority of people who have apparitional experiences with a just deceased relative or friend or loved one, they are not in a fever state. They may be in an altered state because it can sometimes happen when they're falling asleep or just waking up. But a lot of these happen to people who are fully awake or in a so-called normal state of consciousness as well. So there are specific cases where individuals may have gotten into a particular altered state that allowed them to have that experience. So we have to consider that, but that's not a one size fits all. There does not seem to be a one size fits all for apparitional experiences, other than what people are experiencing seems to be pretty much in the pattern, even if it's sometimes visual or auditory or getting a sense or smelling something. It still fits the pattern of apparitions in general. We don't see things happening like in the movies, but there is likely a physiological component. It's not identifiable because there's not, first of all, not a huge amount of studies. We do know that the visual is not an optical thing, though. Okay. Speaking of Nepi, just saw him in an interview in New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned Jeffrey. Jeffrey Mishlove has a great YouTube channel called New Thinking Aloud, Allowed. I strongly recommend, if you're really interested in this subject, that you go over his YouTube channel and pick and choose whoever you want to watch. I mean, he does a lot of great interviews. I've been interviewed a few times by him over the years. Jeffrey's a really good interviewer. He is well versed in this subject. He is the only American parapsychologist with a PhD in parapsychology from an accredited American university. His degree was an independent study back in the 70s at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. They didn't do it after that because they felt it was too controversial. But Jeffrey's been around a long time. He's the winner of the Bigelow contest with Best Essay on Evidence for Life After Death. And again, I strongly suggest you go to his New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube. You can either plug in his name, Jeffrey Mishlove, just like it sounds, or New Thinking Aloud. Remember, it's Allowed, not vocal aloud. Thank you for putting the name in there as well, Paul. Okay, that was kind of a bit of a marathon there. Anybody else quite yet here? All right. I know that some of these stories some of you may have heard before. I've talked about them in some of my classes. I know some folks are in my classes as well. But let me just see from kind of a perspective here what might be a fun thing to talk about. All right, so one situation that I should talk about is kind of a silly story in some respect, and I've had a number of these. I've got a couple from my early days in the field when I lived back in New York. In this one, I want to tell you two stories. In one, I had a couple. They were called into the American Society for Psychical Research. Let me just see what this comment is. Ions did some testing of mediums when in trance. Jeffrey Tarrant is currently, that is absolutely right. Thank you, Mariah. Yeah, there is a difference between studying the brain as Tarrant and the others are doing and what the deep scans are, the deep work with temporal lobe activity that Nepi would be involved in. Melody is asking, how often do you think a psychic experience is misdiagnosed or labeled as mental illness? Less today, I think, than it used to be, but not much less. It depends on the psychotherapist they go to. I would say that if someone is disturbed and goes to a psychotherapist, especially a psychiatrist, there is a good chance they're going to be misdiagnosed. Partly because psychologists in general, according to surveys, and I think the number has changed. If you're going outside the general realm of humanistic or transpersonal psychology, which transpersonal psychology also includes spiritual experiences as potentially real. But behavioral psychology, especially, and a number of other schools of psychological thought, in psychiatry, unless you get a psychiatrist who is open to the subject right up front, they're going to give you drugs. People just, if they don't believe in believe that this is a real experience, that this is possible, then there's something wrong with you. So misdiagnosis is pretty real there. Okay, back to the story. So I got the call. We got the call at the ASPR, the American Society for Psychical Research. A couple had footsteps again. Here's another footsteps case. They had a two-story house. They had a walk in kind of an attic, which had at the center point of the attic you could stand up, but it kind of sloped on either side. They had a pull-down set of stairs from the attic to go up there, and they would be hearing footsteps every night, somewhere around between 10:30 and 11:30 at night, before they went to sleep. And the footsteps sounded pretty loud, and they would pull down the stairs. Initially, they pull down the steps. They go up. The guy would go up there and look, and there's nobody there. Shining a flashlight around, turning the light on. He can't figure out what's going on. So he thinks his house is haunted. It was a fairly old house, built in the late 1800s, if I recall correctly. So I decided in that case, I went there late at night. We arranged for me to be there at that time. And I decided, instead of just waiting down just right below the attic to see what it sounded like, because that would mean I'd have to go back a second day, I decided to go up and do a little stakeout in the attic. I went up there and with a flashlight, just before 10:30, maybe just a little bit after, and sat down against kind of the sloping roof that was there, essentially the wall, and waited. And the couple just pulled out a couple of chairs and sat right below that. Closed the attic stairs, so whatever was going on, it had to be the same conditions. So I just kind of quietly waited. And as we got closer to 11 o'clock at night, I had the flashlight next to me. It was turned off, so I'm sitting alone in the dark, something I normally wouldn't do, certainly not anymore. But in this case, it did warrant it. That was the conditions under which the footsteps were being heard. And I started hearing a scratching sound from across the attic. And then I hear a scratching sound again, and a little thump, and a scratching sound and a thump, and a scratching sound and a thump. And the guy down below is yelling, "Do you hear the footsteps?" And I hear a scratching sound and a thump. And the direction of the thumping, which is very low volume to me, was coming towards me as it happens. So I let it get pretty close, and then I turned on the flashlight. And I scared the hell out of a squirrel who was apparently rolling a nut along this very rough floor, which was bouncing every so often. So the squirrel runs out and runs back across the attic. I went over to where the squirrel went. There was a hole in just where the roof hits the wall, which is clearly how the squirrel's getting in. I go back to wherever we're sitting, since it was coming over in this direction, and behind a box, there was an area right against the other end of the roof with a bunch of nuts, acorns, and some other stuff sitting there. So apparently the squirrel was squirreling things away for the winter. All right, so I didn't say anything to the couple at that point. Instead, I decided to test the theory. So I grabbed one of the nuts, an acorn or something, and I rolled it across the floor, and it bounced a whole bunch of times. And the guy's yelling, the footsteps. Lloyd, are you okay?" And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And, every once in a while, we as ghost hunters, as investigators, have to do things that are just for us. So I grabbed a handful of the nuts and I rolled them across the floor. And the couple started screaming. I then went immediately. I said, I'm okay. Let me explain. We lowered the stairs. I come downstairs and they were looking at me like I'm possessed or something. And I basically said to them, let me show you exactly how this was. Nothing to do with ghosts. Although the guy did say that it was kind of like the Army of Darkness. He didn't use that phrase. That's from a movie that came out much later, but it was like that. He thought the place had been invaded by spirits or demons or something. I took them up one at a time to show them what was going on. I showed them the hole. He patched that up right away. Felt bad for the squirrel. We did dump the nuts outside, so at least the squirrel could find them the next day. But that was a little bit of a squirrely situation, if you might say. I might say. The other one I had in New York, if there are no questions, was, again, when I was working at the American Society for Psychical Research. And I was teaching adult ed classes at a number of places in the Westchester County area. One of them was in the town of Bedford, which is in Upper Westchester County. And I had a couple students who were both self-identified as psychics. One of them was actually working as a psychic, doing readings. I got to know her really well. The other one had done readings on occasion. She was a good friend of the first psychic I mentioned. And after I taught a few of the classes, Susie, the second psychic, says to me, "We've got a ghost in my house." And I said, "Okay, tell me about the ghost." He said he's kind of scary. He really scares me. Although my son, who was like 12, was not afraid at all. She lived in a Revolutionary War era home, so a very, very old home. And this faceless ghost, she said she could not see his face. There were no features, but everything else was in full 3D focus. She said he shows up every so often and it freaks me out. Can you do something? So instead of me going up and investigating that part of it, I did alert Dr. Osis, Carlos Osis, who was our research director at the ASPR, and Alex Tanis, who was the psychic and medium we worked with at the ASPR. And the two of them went up to the house without me and did a full-on, check of the house, interviewed Susie and her son. Now, Susie's husband had died more than a year before. And when Alex and Dr. Osis talked to the son, he said, "It's my dad." And apparently Susie disagreed because she couldn't see his face. And the son said, "I can see his face." And he said, "I keep on trying to tell you, Mom, it's Dad." And he keeps on showing up. And especially when she was just starting to date again. And that's apparently when the apparition of her late husband showed up. Alex's communication with him, apparently it was the fact that Frank was concerned about her dating in terms of the kinds of guys she would date rather, or would show up, especially with the son being involved there. So he was being a little overprotective. And they worked out a deal where he would, she would at least say out loud, say something about the guy, and hopefully Frank would not come back. And Frank didn't come back more than once or twice after that. But a few months later, I got a call from Susie because apparently there's another ghost. This is a guy who shows up who said to Susie that he died not too far away. He was wandering around for months and months and months, getting really pissed off and frustrated because nobody could see him. And now she can see him. But instead of asking her for help, he's venting his frustration on her and yelling at her and insulting her and doing all sorts of this kind of harassment. And she wanted to know what to do. So I did talk to Alex. Alex was not in the area at the time. He was back up in Maine. And we came up with a couple of solutions here. And the best solution worked. And the solution was pretty simple. It's a kind of a variation of psychic protection. And a lot of folks work with psychic protection. You surround yourself with a bubble of light or a bubble of force or a bubble of energy, however you want to think of it, to prevent things from coming at you. So I took that idea after talking to Alex, and since the ghost appeared mainly in one room of the house, although apparently it appeared in her bedroom as well, but I said, next time you see him, I want you to surround yourself with that bubble of light or bubble of energy. And she knew psychic protection. She knew he couldn't physically hurt her, but he was verbally harassing her, and it was not feeling very good for her. So she has her protection bubble, and I said, no, now start expanding it as if you're blowing up a balloon and push him out of the room. So I want you to imagine, I'm having a conversation with her on the phone. I want you to imagine doing this. So she says, okay, I can visualize doing that. I said, can you push him further out of the house mentally? And he wasn't there at the time I was talking to her, by the way. But can you visualize expanding that bubble to include the entire, the rest of the house, other rooms? She said, yes, I can do that. Can you push that bubble out so it's surrounding the entire house from the outside? So you can't even get near the house. She said, no, I can't visualize that. I said, okay. Well, you can keep him out of the house the other way. She said, no, that's not enough. I said, okay, next time he shows up, I want you to put the bubble around him, like you're putting a bug in a bell jar, in a jar. She said, okay, I'll try that. A few days later, get a call from her. I think it was 3 days later. She said, okay, I got him in the jar. Now what? So what do you mean you have him in the jar? She said, I put him in the jar. He came in after we finished talking that night, and I put him in the jar. I said, did you move the jar outside like I told you? Because I did tell her that. She said, no, did you say that? I said, yes. I said, what's going on? She said, well, he's in the jar, so I'm yelling at him now. And he's begging me to let him go. So I said, okay, move the jar outside and tell him that as long as he never comes back, you will, you won't bother him again. And that was the last time she saw the ghost in the jar. No idea if there really was a ghost there that she was dealing with. But that kind of solution does tend to work quite often. Paul, Sam Parnia's documentary called Rethinking Death can be seen on Eventbrite, October 4th. That's cool. I'll have to look that up. I'll take a look at that. All right. You live in Indonesia. Everyone believes in ghosts here. You're always skeptical and frankly with materials until you know parapsychology, especially the veridical confirmation elements. Different cultures have different beliefs. And some of it is folklore or beliefs that kind of trend back hundreds, if not thousands of years. We had those beliefs in the West as well. People believed in witches as evil beings and burned them at the stake. People believe in the influence of the devil. That still happens here in parts of the United States or in certain religious groups. People believe the earth is flat. Some people still believe that. There are different beliefs, that some are based in reality and some are not. And even cultures that believe in ghosts, what they believe about ghosts has roots sometimes in a lack of understanding or in religious beliefs. So when I say ghosts are people too, we're human, a lot living humans, or at least the majority of them were living humans, and there were not necessarily evil people. I mean, there are some people who are pretty bad, who are filled with hate and anger. They sometimes can stick around. There are those that are just simply, to put this generously, pardon my language, assholes who still are like that, and people who might have been bullies when they were alive. But they really can't physically hurt you, but they can affect you like the harassing ghost affecting Susie. Couldn't physically hurt her, couldn't psychically really hurt her, but could psychologically damage her by behavior for that. Curses, as you're mentioning here, first of all, I want to say that if anybody ever goes to a psychic or medium, this would be psychics, and says that you are cursed, you have a curse on you, someone put a curse on you, get up and leave. Immediately leave. That is a pretty clear sign that this individual is going to try to kind of bilk you for money. That you are depressed because of actions that are happening in the world that you live in, or in your life. I've known people who had a bad breakup in a relationship, and they spiraled psychologically to the point where they lost their job. And then they lost their home because they were no longer working. They just could not pull themselves out of the depression, out of the broken heart that happened, out of the situation that happened. And they came to psychics or other people looking for the curse. It wasn't a curse. It was self-inflicted in some respects. And this is when people are in situations like this is helpful to talk to somebody, not to try to remove a curse, except by changing your outlook or kind of dealing with the emotions that you're feeling. But the idea of cursing people, especially in certain contexts, just is not accurate or real. I'm just kind of thinking about the pop culture idea of the old gypsy curse. And if you really studied at all the Romney people, you'd find that, and of course, beliefs have changed with the Romney over the years, but the original beliefs of the Romney people, and if you look at the actual studies that were done, I knew two professors that actually lived with gypsies, different groups of gypsies, for quite some time. One was with a group in Southeast Asia and Pakistan area for a couple of years, and another with a different group And it dovetailed with what we learned um, from the anthropological interviews that people had done with Romney people. And I even had a student at JFK who was in that from that group was a Rom, and it boiled down to them not believing their second sight or psychic ability worked on anyone other than people who were also Rom or Romney. In other words, who we call gypsies could only do curses on other gypsies. And gypsy curses, which are in some of the literature that's out there, were more like what you used to hear Johnny Carson say on The Tonight Show. May the fleas of 1,000 camels infest your armpits. So those kinds of things. And yet there's this huge folklore in Western culture about the gypsy curse, about people, Ram levying a curse on you, and then, of course, telling you how to get rid of it, too, which has been picked up more exclusively by a lot of other phony psychics. And I've dealt with people who have lost thousands of dollars because of the so-called curses that they were supposedly going to have removed from them by the psychic who kept on saying, oh, no, there's more here. So it's a difficult situation. One of the reasons I ended up getting into magic as in stage magic, as well as parapsychology, because my interest in magic came, although I really loved it, becoming a magician or learning more deeply and then a mentalist later on came out of the need to understand whether we're dealing with a real psychic or not, whether we are dealing with a real phenomena or some other trick of perception, because that happens with people a lot. It's not, people make mistakes in their perceptions, mislabel things, but especially helping people on a consumer end when dealing with not so legitimate psychics. And not to say that everyone who says they're a psychic, who doesn't have psychic ability or good psychic ability is a phony or a fraud. There is a continuum, because there are a lot of people that are very good observers or fairly intuitive, which is not a psychic ability, and can make observations about people that are accurate that the rest of us would completely miss, kind of like Sherlock Holmes. And they may not even be aware that that's what they're doing. They've been told all their lives that they're psychic, so they believe that, or they use that term. That doesn't mean that they're a fraud trying to take you for money. So, and then there are the unethical psychics out there too, who are just out in it for the money, even though they claim, in fact, those folks often claim that they can't use their ability to make money. I knew one very famous psychic who actually constantly would say that, because people would ask her, can you pick the winner of a horse race? And her response, rather than saying, well, the future is cloudy, because it is, her response was, I can't use my ability to make money for myself. And yet she charged over $800 an hour for a reading. And if that's not making money for yourself using your abilities, I don't know what is. So it was very, very disingenuous. And there were other ethical issues that surrounded her as well. Liz, you just now saw the Facebook post. Okay, well, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I mean, I'm gone in a few minutes here, but I'll be back in 2 weeks. And in fact, the next three dates are going to be October 1st, October 15th, and October 29th. And we'll have to do something special for Halloween on the 29th. I'm sure we can do that. So anybody else in the last few minutes that we have, I'm just going to mention again the Rhine Education Center, the Rhine Research Center. Links are in the description for the show here. I'm teaching one class, paranormal case studies, which you might all be interested in. You do not need to have any other classes from the Rhine. If you've never taken anything, you can just take that one class. You can take it for fun. You can take it for a grade towards a certificate. That's going to be on Wednesday nights, starting October 9th for 8 weeks. And then also teaching a class which is Advanced Field Investigations, which does have some prerequisites, which you can see on the website. That'll be Monday nights, starting October 9th. The other one starting the 11th. So the Paranormal Case Studies is on Wednesday nights. And for those of you who don't know what that actually means, I do a live lecture. at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific for that class. But that is recorded and it's up on the in the classroom, which students get access to the following day, usually by the following evening. So that I'd say that at least half of the students that attend or take our classes are not live on the actual live lecture. Uh, it's great if they are, because then we have a discussion period at the end. But otherwise, um, that's something else. Liz, well, good. Good to say hi. It's good to see you, Liz, here. Diane Hennessy Powell has been doing some really incredible work. For those of you who don't know, she has a good book out. It's Diane Powell or Dan. Actually, now it's just Diane Hennessy now. I think she's flipped that around like Liz actually has. All right, and thank you, Dog Mentors, for saying I'm a really good teacher. Yeah, I try to pack my classes with information and stuff that you may not read for the class, but there's always a lot of extras to help you continue your learning. Because I think that one of the most important things, there was a quote by science fiction writer David Gerrold many, many years ago, that learning is a continual process. We should always continue to learn. And that's a really important thing to remember here. All right, so we're down to 2 minutes right now. Oh, Tamara. Okay, good to see you, Tamara. Thank you for mentioning your name there. Please spread the word. I know that many of you are, I think, probably all subscribing, but please do spread the word. Also mention that my producer and I have been talking about doing a special, not sure when it's going to be, but I will make an announcement. Do one a little bit earlier on a Sunday so that our friends over in the United Kingdom can more easily attend. So I might be doing one at 11 a.m., which would be around 2 p.m. Eastern time at some point in the future, in addition to the ones I've got scheduled for our regular scheduled Ask Professor Paranormal. So any new interviews coming up? I've got a couple that I'm doing actually this week. I'm not sure exactly when they're going to be up. I think they'll be up on Friday or Saturday, but I'll post them on my Facebook page and post them also on Twitter, or I should say X. And I'm on Threads as well for those of you who may be moving over to Threads. Just simply Paranormal on Threads for that. Okay. Anybody? Oh, by the way, one last mention. I do recommend the movie A Haunting in Venice. It is a mystery with a seance theme, kind of a spooky theme. It's a Hercule Poirot mystery, but I just saw that yesterday and I do recommend it or something. Okay. Well, with that, I'll say goodbye, and everybody have a great couple of weeks, and see you in October.